If you think of solar, the chances are you're thinking of that. They are, of course, photovoltaic cells, quite possibly the wonder of our age. But solar divides into two. There's photovoltaic, which is a direct translation of solar energy into electrical energy, or solar thermal, which basically uses the heat of the sun. So the history of solar thermal is actually much older than you think, and that's because the history of man's need for power is much older than you think. At the beginning to the middle of the Industrial Revolution, the power source was this stuff. We're actually in the Weald of Kent, and there was a massive deforestation going on in the UK, so much so they worried about where they would get the power from, and of course coal came to save the day. But coal has horrendous problems with pollution, and it was always something that people were worried about. Things were so bad that, for example, in 1904, some 50 years before the country's Air Pollution Act of 1955, the city administrators of Philadelphia created their own regulations for cleaner air, limiting the amount of smoke in flues and chimneys in open spaces and punishing people who emitted fumes of a certain degree of darkness with fines. And it was into this world that American inventor Schumann came. Schumann made his money with safety glass. He put wire inside of glass panes to make them harder to break, and that made him a fortune. He used that fortune to feed his obsession, because he was absolutely obsessed with solar power. What he did basically was arrange parabolic mirrors around pipes and boil the water in the pipes. He used that low pressure steam to run his sun engine, and in 1913 he had a large scale setup in Egypt, but he was preceded by some 40 years by a Frenchman, Augustin Mouchot, who in 1871 received funding from the French Academy of Science to build a solar generator. Due to economic and political considerations and the arrival of oil, none of that actually came to anything. That would have probably remained the case apart from the Second World War ended. And of course, at the end of the war, the soldiers came home. And they came home to a very different world with very different expectations, because they'd died, they'd sacrificed. What they wanted was a world of peace. Well, the country they came back to, of course, was dramatically changed. Mass production had overtaken for the war effort, resources had been directed there, construction had more or less ceased, and when the soldiers came back, there was basically nowhere for them to live. So around places like Chicago and LA and New York, veterans and their families were living in abandoned buses, trailer parks, camp cities, that sort of thing. And it was certainly a situation that was less than ideal. And it was William Levitt who came to the rescue. It was an architect, and he'd served in the Navy doing pontoons, emergency buildings, engineering works for 4 years, and he brought that experience and mass production to the production of housing. He broke house building down into 26 steps, and each trade was responsible for one step, and the men worked in teams moving from one house to the next. The house components he built almost like a Lego kit in the factory, reducing waste, shipping them out to site and erecting them very quickly indeed. In 1 year he built 17,000 homes, and at one stage he was producing a house every 11 minutes. He's been called the father of suburbia. His first successful project was a 1,000-acre project just on Long Island that was called Levittown, but he built many, many more, and they were all on the same pattern: build a road, set out the lots, bring in the house kits, bring in the construction. It was a phenomenon. That house cost about $4,000 to make. That's about $65,000 in today's terms. And with state aid, subsidy and mortgages, a Levitt house could be bought for about $400, which worked out about $60 a month over a 30-year mortgage. That meant about 3 days' wages to buy yourself a home. And of course this led to a fundamental shift in American living, because it was now cheaper to buy a house out in the brand new suburb than it was to rent somewhere in the city. That distribution, that movement out of the city, of course, equally led to the importance of automobiles and the growth of roads in the USA. Of course, such rapid and massive growth is going to have problems, and one of the biggest issues probably was energy, how to power all these homes. During the war, domestic oil consumption had been reduced so that you could maximise what was sent into the war effort, and that was still in place. That meant that the American government placed a lot of money and emphasis on solar, and into this stepped the Sun Queen, Maria Telkes. Maria became an American citizen in 1937, and in 1939 went to work at MIT on the practical applications of solar power. And what she came up with? Well, it's myriad. Some of the most important and famous ones were a portable solar distillation pack, which was issued to airmen during the war and reportedly saved many lives. But she also worked on solar broilers, solar cookers. She worked on the Novoid, which was a solar engine very similar to what Schumann had actually been working on. But perhaps the greatest contribution she made was solar thermal heat store. She used a phase change material. In her case, it was Glauber's salt, or sodium sulfate, perhaps one of the most innocent salts apart from salt that you're actually going to find. In essence, the sun was passed through some glass, it heated the air, that hot air was blown over the salt, it melted the salt, and that stored the energy. Now, it was so efficient that by around the 1950s, about 80% of houses in Florida were equipped with that kind of thermal store. The houses she worked on were in the region of 75% efficient, and if you look at the kind of things she was talking about and working on and developing, you can in fact find them for sale on Amazon. Now, they're very similar to what Maria was actually creating back then. Of course, there's a very big problem with that kind of solar. It offers no interest at all to the electrical generation companies or the electrical equipment manufacturers. And here we're talking about people like General Electric and Westinghouse. I mean, why would it be? It didn't use electricity. And they weren't about to take this lying down. So what they did was they got themselves a television studio, hired Ronald Reagan, wrote happy jingles about how you could have your cake and eat it, and referred to appliances as electric servants. The tagline was, "Live better electrically." So they launched a very aggressive advertising campaign, but that wasn't the only thing they did. They also went to see good old William Levitt and cut a deal with him. The deal was that they would lay the cables as long as he linked up the houses to the electrical supply and forced the people who bought the houses to use their electricity. And that appeal to shameless consumerism and a few backroom deals is what the electric companies hoped would be the end of alternative power. But of course, we're still stumbling through energy crises like the 1976 crisis and the one that we're going through at the moment, when alternatives are something that people are actively looking at. And of course, the ability of the large companies to supply all of our needs is under question, particularly here in the UK, where we do have brownouts and we do have a creaking infrastructure, and the investment needed is looking shocking for anybody, no pun intended. It means that we're looking at alternatives ourselves where we can be more self-sufficient in terms of energy, and that means we're looking again at solar. Now, solar, remember, is a two-pronged fork. Solar PV will supply electricity directly, but solar thermal can supply a huge amount of our energy requirement when you think the bulk of our requirement is heating and cooling. And of course, big corporations will try to force people to buy their services and their products. That's no surprise. But luckily, there are always some rugged-minded individuals who will investigate the alternatives. And that's why we see this stuff happening time and time again. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and please do remember to like and subscribe.